Hello, my dear friends. How is it going? I'm Hedegus, and today I'm here to talk about cats, but in Nordic witchcraft. I'm not going to take much of your time, don't worry. It's just to enter in the mood of the season, for it is an October video. Besides, this is a synthesis of two videos I've already done concerning cats and witchcraft in medieval Scandinavia, which were 2 out of 3 videos I've done in memory of my cat and best friend, Mr. Tico, whom you have still met in some of my earliest videos. But I have 2 cats now, my 2 little girls rescued from the streets 3 years ago, and this video is for them. Da-da-da-da! Here's Buckbeak! This is Gigi. This is Sol. My journey to the stars. So let's get straight into the point. I'll just touch on some points spoken here before on the other videos, and I shall develop on others that were left unsaid. Well, in Scandinavia of the early Middle Ages, cats were acquired and used as protective animals on farms. But there was also a certain magical religious understanding surrounding these animals. In the Icelandic sagas, some practitioners of Seidr being magical and divinatory arts of a semi-shamanic character, and the practitioners of Seidr used gloves and accessories made from the fur of white cats, symbolically related to the goddess Freyja. This seems to have been an element that would indicate that cats were some of the animal spirits used by the seers, the prophetesses and soothsayers in their magical performances, and quite possibly the spiritual form they took in spirit journeys, such as the case of the fylgjur, the auxiliary familiar animals, familiar spirits, and also as mind emissaries, as the projection of part of the self of a practitioner of magic. In pre-Christian Norse society, the cat was also associated with fertility. As previously mentioned in older videos, cats' heads were seen as propitiation objects, not only of fertility magic, or rather propitiating such type of beneficial magic, but also seen as containing the spirit of the animal, and as such would be a conduit for the evocation of the goddess Freyja. Cats' heads and also the animal itself, still whole and alive, were also understood to provide magical protection. Also, on the Osberg ship burial were found several objects and reliefs with cat shapes, such as posts connecting these animals with the world of the dead and the goddess Freyja. Although there was a progressive demonization of cats in post-Christian European culture and mostly with Protestantism in continental Europe, during antiquity, until the period of feudalism, cats controlled the rat population in cities and monasteries, being an extremely positive figure, in fact. Many saints were associated with cats, with Saint Gertrude of Neville being their patron, being a saint against rats and mice and the plague, therefore protector of cats, who ended up becoming a beneficial symbol against pestilence, but also associated with Saint Agatha, who was called the Holy Cat. She was a martyr saint from Catania in Sicily, although this association occurred mostly in south of France as a legend in which Saint Agatha would appear in the guise of a cat to women who had the impertinence to weave or wash on her day, which is the 5th of February. Well, this is where the word Catholic comes from, which is short for cataholic, an absolute, uncontrollable necessity to turn cats into saints. No, well, obviously not, I'm just kidding, but it would have been a far better religion, though. In several manuscripts dating from the 11th and the 12th centuries, cats are generally represented in light colors, defined as predators of black rats and typically domestic animal. Some illuminations associate these animals with Noah's wife, while this patriarchal biblical figure is related to the dog. Well, this is to tell you that in this way we understand that felines were also symbols of the feminine. The feminine, Mr. Colin, I have learned my lesson. Feminine, not feminine. Again, this to tell you that in this way we understand that felines were also symbols of the feminine and regarded as quite the positive figures for Christianity at this time. A tradition that is maintained by Catholic Christian culture. It is with the beginning of the imaginary of witchcraft as a diabolical and heretical sect from the 10th century onwards, when the church began to turn much more towards fight against the preservation of pagan traditions that still remained quite strong in folklore, in the imaginary and in traditional popular culture of medieval Europe. It was at this time that this animal gained malevolent connotations for the Christian imagination, and then starting in the 13th century, well, finally culminating in the 13th century when much more concrete ideas were formed in relation to witchcraft and the pact with the devil. Therefore, in 1232, the papal decree, Vox in Rama, called for the persecution of heretics. In this document, Pope Gregory IX describes the devil's activities in northern Germany, including an initiation ceremony where participants perform an obscene kiss on a large black cat. It was the beginning of persecution and prejudice that continues to this day in relation to dark-colored felines. Therefore, if you want to blame someone for this superstition on black cats, it was Pope Gregory IX. In a certain way, it's funny, but horrible, but funny all the same, because human actions guided by fear, superstition, ignorance, and lack of respect for the natural world and its living beings, precisely with this whole new mentality against black cats, well, it contributed in part to the extensive spread of the Black Death in the 14th century, as the rats that spread the bubonic plague no longer had predators in many cities and towns, as cats had been exterminated by the general population. Take that, you human bastards. In Scandinavia, after Christianization, we notice that while some ancient symbols were preserved in terms of the magical thought and practices, also in relation to cats and the whole idea of cats associated with the goddess Freyja, they were gradually incorporated into the new imagery introduced by the continent. But this transition is not easy to study, mind you. I think one of the best examples of this is the image preserved in the cathedral of Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark, present-day Germany, made in the 1200s. Freyja, or a figure that has been assumed to be the goddess Freyja, appears to fly on a large light-colored feline, without clothes and carrying a horn, a clearly pagan image perhaps, but in a Christian context. But we have not yet noticed in this painting a direct association with the notion of heresy or diabolical evil. However, I would like to take a moment to reflect a little bit on this figure and another figure as well, something I've already shared with my patrons some time ago, last year, and I think this is relevant for the subject we are dealing with here today. So, let's take a quick look on the history of art. Well, this image you see right here somewhere on the screen is circa 12th century, 1300s of the Common Era depiction of a cloaked woman riding a large cat, which appears on a wall in the Schleswig Cathedral in Schleswig-Holstein, former Denmark, nowadays northern Germany. She is commonly interpreted as Freyja, the Old Norse goddess. She's also alongside another feminine figure riding a broom, interpreted as Frigg, an old Germanic goddess, wife of Odin or Wotan. These are Christian depictions of what we could perhaps call proto-witch figures. These two representations are one of the biggest puzzles, we could say, about medieval Scandinavia. Two female representations that were painted, as I said, in St. Peter's Cathedral in Schleswig in Germany, originally Denmark. They were dated around the year 1300, which led to the traditional interpretation that they were the goddesses Freyja, riding on a cat, and Frigg or Freyja, flying on a broom. This interpretation is very common in books, websites, and even on postcards sold in this church. More recently, however, researchers have questioned the date of these two figurations, considering that they would have been made in the mid-15th century and not in the 13th century as thought before. Therefore, the previous interpretation began to be questioned, leading to a new interpretation or new interpretations and new studies on this context. The first female figure is therefore not the goddess Freyja after all. There are no literary or iconographic traditions of her riding cats, and the church animal is actually a fantastical being in the form of a feline with anthropomorphic features and supernatural size. I should remind you that Freyja was indeed associated with cats, calm down, but there is no evidence whatsoever that the goddess rides them, which is another thing. One of the main reasons that led to the association between Freyja and cats in this particular context was because this goddess was quite important in the social space of Scandinavian nobility, and the cat, a rare animal in Northern Europe, even in the Middle Ages or in medieval times, would be a companion animal of wealthy members of the Scandinavian society, of the Scandinavian elites. Another factor must also be taken into account concerning feline sexuality and fertility in relation to these same connotations in the Freyja cult. However, the cat became a more usual symbol, especially in churches, but also in manuscripts and illustrations in other literary works in medieval times, both as representative figure of evil and the demonic, as well as in relation to pest control within the domestic environment. But according to the latest research, it seems that this fresco in the church is not a cat, but a supernatural being. The second figure is even more questionable. Frigg was never depicted nude, let alone flying around. An important historical detail is that the iconographic tradition of witches flying on broomsticks dates back to 1450, so the mid-15th century. The two female figures can only be analyzed if we take into account two contexts. First, the huge amount of paintings representing fantastic beings existing in a side wing of this cathedral and dating from the late Middle Ages, such as dragons, dwarfs, centaurs, all painted with a clearly late aesthetic. The second context is the botanical one. The cathedral is full of paintings, sculptures, ornamentation, and symbolism of flowers and plants that are very important for the daily life of the region. For example, the second female figure, the so-called Frigg, is flying on a broom made of milk thistle, Silybum marianum, a therapeutic and hallucinogenic plant, very popular from the transition to the Renaissance. In case this may lead to ideas of the plant being associated with Frigg and a possible connection to a trance state related to the cult of the goddess, well, there are no evidences of any cult associated to Frigg, let alone specific plants and other objects related to this goddess, aside of course from spinning and weaving, which was also associated with the goddess Freyja, but both goddesses were merged together and it is hard to understand which one's attributes was assimilated into the other. Besides, Frigg did not have much relevance in the religious scope in Scandinavia. The association between hallucinogenic plants and magical women, in this case witches, is rather late into the Middle Ages. Therefore, the two figurations show evidences that they are already in a context not only far from the old Nordic traditions, but also there's a clear popular and religious imagination stepping away from such traditions of the past, creating new types of folkloric associations and material that we do not see in pre-Christian Scandinavian belief systems. Thus, the two figurations are fully inserted in the late Middle Ages context of continental Europe, and in this way, they are not goddesses, but they are indeed representations of witches. As I was saying before, or rather, let me be more specific lest there's some confusion. Witches began to be associated with black cats from the end of the 15th century, but before that, cats had already been associated with the devil first. That's why I think it's worth sharing with you here a little curiosity about this relationship between cat and devil from the medieval imaginary in relation to the medieval Nordic populations. So, prejudice, superstition, contempt, and even fear of black cats originated in medieval times, as I said, starting with the papal bull Vox in Rama, 1232. In it, Pope Gregory IX described the actions of a heretical sect that would exist in the German city of Mainz. The members of this sect would worship Satan in the form of a statue of a black cat, which would come to life during the ritual. In the medieval imagination, the black cat came to be associated with the devil, either appearing in rituals of heresy, such as those of the Waldacians and Cathars, or even in representations of the church. In the images presented here on the screen, we have two such examples in the Church of Mary Magdalene, Marie Magdalene Kirke, Denmark, 15th century. The representation of a demon in the form of a cat tramples a person, and another one which is a cat and a witch. The influence of this medieval imagination towards the cat was also reflected in the Icelandic sagas. A narrative preserved in an Icelandic saga seems to point more directly to the new imagery where the black cat was associated with the evil world of darkness. In Vetnzila saga, section 28, dating to the 1300s, a man named Þorólfur Seigja lived with 20 huge black cats, causing great fear on his neighbors, who ended up burning the house down and killing him. But even after his death, people avoided the place out of fear of cats. But the Middle Ages did not represent the cat and the black cat only with prejudice and in an evil way. There are also drawings and several images in manuscripts that show a great affection for the animal, which kept company and was used as a pest control in monasteries and homes. Well, with knowledge of history and empathy and respect for the lives of others, perhaps one day prejudice towards animals will just be a bad memory that future generations will see as simple ignorance of the past. But in addition to the new imagery created with or by Christianity, cats were still used for magical operations in the population's daily lives, or in other words, in traditional folk beliefs and magic. As we are dealing with Scandinavia, some magic practitioners from Sweden who were arrested and condemned by the Inquisition during the High Middle Ages, their witchcraft practices were revealed, in part, such as Galna Catherine the Mad in 1471 and Margarida in 1490. Among the main elements used for witchcraft concerning love, as an example, there were heads and brains of cats, but for different purposes. While Catherine used the spell to regain lost love for a woman, Margarida used the same to cause impotence in a man. Another magical tradition known in Scandinavia, but originally from Germany, was the belief in cat stones supposedly found in the skulls of feline and which had properties to increase sexual desire. One of the lost Nordic medieval, late medieval Scandinavian references to this animal is a painting found in the Church of Mary Magdalene, as I said before, Denmark, as shown previously in here somewhere, made between 1475 and 1510. In it, a cat is between a woman and a demon squirming to lick its private parts. It is a representation of the devil in this context. Thus, from a positive conception where the cat was a symbol of divinity and a protective animal against harmful magic and propitiating fertility, it now becomes the very representation of evil and darkness throughout the High and Late Middle Ages. With the immense, outrageous spread of this latter imagery in modernity, the cat, and especially the black cat, is still seen in extremely negative terms these days, demonstrating that superstition and fear are not only characteristics of the remote past, but, unfortunately, still persist in our time. Hopefully, the subjects of study in this video will help to put an end to these nonsensical fears and superstitions, and absolute stupidity. My dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.